While we are holding space for the lyrics of Defying Gravity, let's look to them to try and understand why Glinda did not get on that broom.
Get on. What?
Now, I've seen a few people say that this is Glinda being unable to let go of her comfortable, privileged life, and while that is relevant, I think it's a bit complicated by her own lines in the Defying Gravity scene. There's 3 lines I want to look at in particular. The first is, "You've hurt your cause forever."
I hope you're happy how you've hurt your cause forever. I hope you think you're clever.
Regardless of what is the moral choice for Elphaba to take, Glinda is right here. By denying the wizard, Elphaba has made it harder for herself to do anything for the animals. But there's really no way for Elphaba not to. She can't engage in the kind of social engineering that someone like Glinda can. Elphaba cannot hide her emotions, and she cannot stand by when witnessing an injustice, even when doing so temporarily would allow her to prevent it on a larger scale.
Why can you stay calm for once instead of flying off the handle?
If she were to pretend to side with the wizard for just a moment, she could easily have dismantled everything very quickly. But she cannot live a lie like that. It's not just because it goes against her morals and integrity, but it goes against who she is as a person. She just cannot do it anymore. A big part of Defying Gravity is her accepting that about herself, that she cannot pretend to be okay with what's happening. But it's at the expense of the animals that she could be helping, which to her is just a temporary setback because, as Glinda also says, she's having delusions of grandeur.
And I make you understand you're having delusions of grandeur.
It's probably the most important thing to understand. She thinks that she is going to be able to defeat the wizard, not just because she has the Grimmery and all of this magical ability, but because she had a vision of
a celebration throughout us. It's all to do with me.
That is why she thinks she's going to match them in renown.
So now match them in renown.
However, that vision is the celebration of her death that we saw at the beginning of the movie. Her singing about it in The Wizard and I is like tragically ironic, and it is affecting her choices here. Glinda is right to think that her plan is rash and not fully thought out. And again, to be clear, none of this is to say that Elphaba is in the moral wrong for making this choice. Simply that her choice is not a strategic one, and we, the audience, know that it is going to end in tragedy for her and seemingly Glinda, who is clearly upset during No One Mourns the Wicked. I'll talk about this further when I get into spoilers for part 2, but first I want to talk about one more line that Glinda has.
If we work in tandem.
It's very telling that Glinda says the line, "if we work in tandem," when it seems like she is about to accept going with Elphaba. But what does working in tandem actually look like for them, especially given the previous lines that Glinda said? Social engineering that Glinda excels at requires a level of status and power. She can do all of these social things that Elphaba could not. Not only does Glinda see that Elphaba is overestimating her own powers, but Glinda does not even have a fraction of them. If Glinda went with Elphaba, they would not be working in tandem. Glinda would be doing nothing. She would lose her status and only source of social power by becoming a fugitive in the same way that Elphaba is about to. But at the very least, Elphaba is a powerful witch. She is still going to be capable of doing things on her own. Glinda is not, and this is something that Glinda has been thinking about since the beginning of the film. Both Glinda and Elphaba at the beginning wanted what each other had. Glinda wanted to be a powerful sorceress, and Elphaba wanted to be popular and loved. And this moment in Defying Gravity is a form of self-acceptance for both of them. They are embracing themselves rather than trying to be each other. It has already been made clear that Glinda is willing to sacrifice her social status for Elphaba.
What are you doing? Stop.
Throughout the whole movie since Popular, she has been concerned about not just her own ambition, but Elphaba's as well. With all of this in mind, it makes much more sense, to me at least, that her not getting on the broom has less to do with her being unwilling to give up her status because it would be giving up comfortability, but rather her being ambitious enough to understand that giving up her status is giving up all of her capabilities, and after doing so, she will not be able to do anything. She knows Elphaba's plan is not fully thought out, so she is not going to be able to help her friend in any way unless she stays. And I think this is something that both her and Elphaba come to terms with. They both know that if Glinda went with her, then she would actually just be holding Elphaba back. matter how we feel about either of these approaches, the text is not really saying one is better than the other. We can say one is better if we think it is, but that's not what the musical is saying, and I don't think it's the direction that the movies are going to go in either. Also, to be clear, she is not necessarily going to do all of the things that Elphaba would have if she was able to be this social engineering type that Glinda is. Her priority in this conversation is her friend. The animals are simply an extension of that. That's why she refers to it as Elphaba's cause, not their cause or something. It's complicated and really should be discussed with the nuance of Act 2. That is an unfortunate consequence of them splitting this movie. I think it was a good choice, and I really like that they turned this into as long of a movie as they did, but a lot of people have only seen part 1 and are unaware of what's going to happen in part 2, which really can inform a lot of this further. And on that note, let's get into some spoilers. Elphaba acknowledges in For Good that she is limited, and she needs someone like Glinda to do basically everything that Elphaba had been hoping to accomplish. At the beginning of this movie, Glinda is pretending to hate her because Elphaba gave them a scapegoat and made Glinda promise not to tell them the truth of what happened, and instead allow them to hate her and blame her for everything. In the second act, Elphaba realizes that everything that she hopes to accomplish has to be done by somebody like Glinda. Elphaba herself is limited. In the end, change happened because Glinda stayed. Also because Elphaba left. They needed to work in tandem in their own ways. And I think the part 1 movie does a really good job at setting up the fact that this is the direction that it's going to go in. I understand why someone might come out of this movie, or even the whole musical, disliking Glinda. I think there's a lot of value in at least understanding that Glinda is a dynamic character that changes over the course of not only the whole musical, but just this movie alone as well. And while we might view her as a morally complex character, that doesn't mean that she's the villain.
In The Wizard of Oz, Glinda asks Dorothy, "Are you a good witch or a bad witch?" And Dorothy says, "I'm not a witch at all, because witches are old and ugly." And Glinda laughs and says, "Only bad witches are ugly." So why did Glinda ask her if she was a good witch or a bad witch? Did she think she was ugly?
It's actually kind of the opposite. Because only bad witches are ugly, good witches are never ugly. What is meant here is either a compliment to Dorothy or a neutral statement, depending on how Glinda is using the word ugly. If she's saying only bad witches can be ugly in terms of appearance, then she's actually saying that Dorothy is pretty, or at the very least, not ugly. Because then the implication is that good witches are never ugly, and bad witches can be ugly but could also be pretty. So Dorothy must not be ugly if she thinks she could be a good or a bad witch. The alternative is that Glinda is using the word ugly in terms of character, like being ugly on the inside. If that's the case, then she's probably simply equating badness to internal ugliness. And of course, that reflects the actual reason why she's asking the good witch, bad witch question to begin with, because she doesn't know Dorothy. If it was based on appearance, it would have to be a positive comment that she can't tell that Dorothy is a good or a bad witch. If it's based on the inside, she can't tell because she just met her. It would have been what this person I stitched thought if she had said, only ugly witches are bad, or bad witches are only ugly. If she had said either of those, and we assume that she was talking about appearance, then she would be saying that good witches can be pretty or ugly, but bad witches are always ugly, therefore Dorothy must be. But instead, she said the opposite. Also, rhetoric is fun. The release of the Wicked movie, I've seen a lot of people share their hot takes about both Wicked and the original Wizard of Oz, and while I think some of them are great, especially those that are about the wizard and Elphaba, I think there's a lot about both versions of Glinda that I've seen people say that I have some disagreements with. For example, and this has been going on for a long time, people love to paint Glinda from the original Wizard of Oz movie as the villain. One of the biggest reasons being that she sends Dorothy on this journey only to reveal at the end that Dorothy could have went home this whole time.
You don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas.
And I understand why people would see that and think, oh, that's kind of messed up to do, but I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about why her character exists in the first place. The entire experience of Oz is a dream, and the goal really isn't for Dorothy to go home, but rather for her to go on the journey of self-discovery and understanding that Glinda sends her on. And yes, I know it's not a dream in the book, however, I'm responding to an interpretation of this film, not the original fictional book. The reason Glinda doesn't tell Dorothy that she needs to say there's no place like home until the end is because she doesn't believe it until the end. That is the point. At the beginning, Dorothy is singing about how she wants to escape the reality that she's currently living in, but by the end of this movie, she realizes how much she loves her family and her home and that she wants to go back there. The reason Glinda told her she had the power to go home all along is because she had the power within herself to change, which is what would allow her to go home. She doesn't need a wizard to do it. She needs to do it herself.
No, she had to find it out for herself. Now those magic slippers will take you home in 2 seconds.
By the end of her journey, she doesn't just miss her family, but genuinely misses her home, not just because she's afraid. It also makes sense this movie came out during the Great Depression. There's this push to live within reality instead of just escapism.
She had to learn it for herself.
What have you learned, Dorothy?
Well,
I think that it wasn't enough just to want to see Uncle Henry and Auntie Em. And it's that if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with.
And Glinda helps push Dorothy in the direction of understanding that without just giving her the answer the way that Dorothy wanted the wizard to. Because if she had, Dorothy never would have actually internalized it. She would have went home because she was frightened about this new experience and not because she genuinely loved home and wanted to be home. And because of that, the slippers wouldn't have worked. Dorothy needed to understand all of this, to have gone on this journey in order for them to do so. Her having the power inside of her all along is simply the capacity to have this change, to undergo this change, not actually having the ability to go home. So what Glinda did helped Dorothy not only in terms of character growth, but also is what actually was able to allow her to go home. She's not the villain here, nor is she in Wicked, which we can talk about another time.
I'm Glinda, the Witch of the North.
I don't think it's fully clear that Glinda gave Dorothy the slippers in this movie because they just appear on Dorothy's feet, but let's assume that she magically is the one that made that happen. It seems to be the case that this Wicked Witch of the West, not the one from Wicked, not Elphaba, but this woman, doesn't care about the shoes because they were her sisters, but rather because they are magic. She keeps referring to them as her slippers.
Give me back my slippers. I'm the only one that knows how to use them. They're no use to you. Give them back to me. Give them back.
And also, throughout the movie, she doesn't say she wants them because they were her sisters. She says she wants them because they're powerful. It is interesting to consider her perspective, especially since so much of The Wizard of Oz is about false reality. Like, even this whole scene is based off a false premise.
No, it was an accident. I didn't mean to kill anybody.
But she is very clearly evil. Glinda says that she's worse than her sister, which seems to be evidenced by the Munchkins being afraid of her in this scene, and also literally everything that she does throughout the whole film.
Those slippers will never come off as long as you're alive. But that's not what's worrying me. It's how to do it.
We know that her sister was pretty bad because the Munchkins are celebrating her death because they are now free from her terrorizing them. And we've already been told only bad witches are ugly, so her being green and looking like this is likely meant to indicate her inner badness. And before somebody comments, just a reminder that this movie is not in the same canon as Wicked. Wicked is essentially a fan fiction of this movie and its source material. That's why it's important when you're going back to this movie to try and differentiate these characters from their Wicked counterparts. This Wicked Witch of the West is essentially everything that Dorothy was expecting a witch to be, which makes sense in the context of this movie being a dream. Her appearance is meant to contrast with Glinda's, where Dorothy was surprised that there could be good witches that don't look like this. So then when she meets a witch that looks like this, she understands, oh, it's because she's bad. She also has all the witch stereotypes, flying on a broomstick, having this hat, etc. She is supposed to be the image of a witch that Dorothy has been imagining. And I say Dorothy here, but I really mean the audience. All that being said, if Glinda was actually the one who put the slippers on Dorothy, then she did have a kind of mean interaction mocking her by saying, oh, you forgot the ruby slippers, knowing that she was going to put them on Dorothy.
You forgetting the ruby slippers?
The slippers. Yes. The slippers. They're gone. The ruby slippers. What have you done with them? Give them back to me or I'll...
It's too late. There they are, and there they'll stay.
But she's mocking a cartoonishly evil person who's threatening a little girl.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
And her evilness or wickedness gets reinforced throughout the film as we see other things that she's done. So Glinda's potential mocking there is supposed to feel justified, especially because she seems to want them to be even more powerful, which would not be a good thing. And it's possible that Glinda actually didn't know that the slippers were going to go on Dorothy, so this wasn't meant to be mocking and was just a campy line. But either way, I would say Glinda's treatment of the Wicked Witch of the West in this film is not villainous. Also, if we want to bring the source material in the book, she doesn't even acknowledge the fact that the slippers were her sisters or any kind of relation to the Wicked Witch of the East. And it's possible that sister here really means sister in the craft and not biological. But again, either way, I don't think that she is actually concerned about getting her sister's slippers. Instead, she wants those slippers that she refers to as her own for power. Some people get mad when you call Wicked Wizard of Oz fanfiction because they assume you mean it as an insult. The reality is most people who call it fanfiction aren't doing so as an insult, but as an easy way of explaining how the canon is different. Here's the general timeline of what happened. Around the year 1900, L. Frank Baum published the Wonderful Wizard of Oz books. Then, in 1939, 20 years after his death, there was a film adaptation of the first book that changed quite a lot, but generally kept the same premise of the story. Then, in 1995, almost 100 years after the original books were published, a fan of them named Gregory Maguire decided to come up with an alternate version of the story with his own unique backstory for the Wicked Witch of the West. His story combined some of what was in the original books, along with some things that were introduced in the 1939 film, like her skin being green, and then a lot of his own unique ideas for the story. His version was then adapted into a musical in 2003, which also changed quite a lot, especially expanding Glinda's role in the story. And then finally this year they released a film adaptation of Act 1 of that musical. Now none of this is that unusual. Ever since at least Paradise Lost, people have been recreating their own versions of classic stories that repaint the villain as sympathetic. There is something unique about the way people discuss Wicked and its relation to its source material. You see, for hundreds of years, pretty much everyone has understood that Paradise Lost and its future adaptations were not canon to the Bible. They were just their own unique story. Yes, it's a retelling of Genesis from Satan's perspective, but nobody thought it was trying to say this is the true canon. Rather, it has its own unique canon that might make you rethink things about the original, but still is distinct from it. When people call it Bible fanfiction, while being somewhat tongue-in-cheek, they're not actually making a commentary on its quality, but rather simply its relationship to the original work. I think most people understand this when it comes to other modern works doing something similar, like when somebody is discussing the original Sleeping Beauty, people aren't like, well, actually, in the movie Maleficent, we see blah, blah, blah is the actual canon. It's understood that Maleficent is its own unique take on the story, just as Sleeping Beauty is its own unique take on the original fairy tale. But for some reason, when it comes to Wicked, I very often see this expectation that it is the true story and should affect our understanding of the original books and film. Very often, online especially, I'll see somebody say something about the original Wizard of Oz books or the 1939 film, and somebody will comment, actually you're wrong because plot of Wicked. And this sort of retroactive interpretation can be somewhat frustrating because when it comes to adaptations, the older work cannot be informed by the newer one in the way that the newer one can be informed by the older one. For example, we can imagine the 1939 film as wizard propaganda while Wicked is the true story, but only if we are looking at both stories through the lens of Wicked. We can discuss them as two separate stories with different canons, but if we are going to have an intertextual discussion of them together, it has to be with the understanding that Wicked was created with the Wizard of Oz existing in mind, whereas the reverse is not true. We cannot be dismissive of interpretations of the original Wizard of Oz that do not fit into the Wicked canon, especially because even if they weren't made decades apart, there are massive changes that have to be made to make them work together. Like, Dorothy basically could not have traveled with the Scarecrow, and also the Wicked Witch could not have set him on fire, which, as a reminder, is what happens that causes Dorothy to splash water onto the Wicked Witch, because it's coming off the water that she's splashing onto the Scarecrow to put out the fire that the Wicked Witch set on him. None of that works with what happens in Wicked, and even if we were to imagine it as a form of propaganda and not just its own story that fits into Wicked, it still would change so much that it could be understood as its own thing. But any interpretation like this is still being retroactively done because the story of the original 1939 film was created completely independently of Wicked, whereas the reverse is not true. Again, none of that is any kind of qualitative statement about either, simply distinguishing where the difference lies. I do think it's interesting though how this happens with Wicked, but not really other adaptations of The Wizard of Oz. Like, people don't really imagine Zelina from Once Upon a Time as being the real canon to The Wizard of Oz, or even like the Oz Great and Powerful movie, which is doing something similar to this, but with the wizard instead of the Wicked Witch. I wonder if it's because people are mostly familiar with this now through the movie, but originally through the musical, and know that Wicked is based off of book, and also that The Wizard of Oz is based off of books, so they think that perhaps they are within the same series. I've seen people comment that before, thinking that that was the case, or that people have only read Wicked or just don't know that these are two completely separate canons / like are written almost 100 years apart. Either way, it would be like if you wrote an interesting and well-written fan fiction giving Hagrid an evil backstory and changing all of the characters slightly because of it, and then it becoming so successful that people start getting upset with or dismissing anybody who is interpreting Hagrid as a good person, even though that is obviously what is happening in the original. Because that is often what's happening here, people, when discussing The Wizard of Oz, will sometimes refer to this as fanfiction so that people can understand the distinction between the two and not leave commentary that are trying to dismiss what you're discussing based off the canon of Wicked. Not because Wicked is bad or you can't just for fun imagine The Wizard of Oz through the lens of Wicked, but simply because it is a separate canon from Wicked, and Wicked isn't even really trying to adapt the story, but rather come up with its own version and backstory for it. My main field of research is adaptation studies, and it can be complicated trying to discuss them in a space like TikTok, where there is a wide range of understanding how adaptations work. And there's a wide range of people understanding what is and isn't an adaptation in regards to specific canons. Like, multiple people in my comments thought originally that Wicked was part of the Wizard of Oz books, when it's not. It was something that was written almost a century later by somebody completely unrelated. And pointing that out isn't saying that Wicked is bad or that there's a problem here. It's just helping people understand the distinction between these stories. I saw a great video that made me realize part of the reason people struggle with understanding that Wicked has no official relationship to the original Wizard of Oz and was written by a completely different guy 100 years later is because they're not used to modern stories being in the public domain. Like, they see her name is Glinda and they think, oh, well, it must be an official part of the story then, because that's her name in the original 1930s film and also the original 1900s Frank Baum books. Like, we understand today if a Harry Potter movie comes out, it has to be official because people would have to have the licensure to make it. But that is a relatively new concept. That's why in the past we see a lot more retellings and things that we would now think of as fan fiction. And that's how we're able to have stories like this. Anybody can write a story about the Wizard of Oz. They can come up with their own random backstory for any of the characters and get it published because the Wizard of Oz is in public domain. Although that's not the case for all of these adaptations and derivative works. The Ruby Slippers are copywritten to the 1939 Wizard of Oz film. And some random person couldn't just make their own movie of Wicked. It had to be officially licensed. But any person can do what Gregory Maguire did and just write a book that takes place in the Wizard of Oz or gives them a backstory or whatever. Or they can make their own movie. But yeah, Wicked is just a story some random guy came up with because he thought that it would be interesting and cool to write a backstory for the Wicked Witch of the West. It has no connection to the original Wizard of Oz author. That's something that used to happen all the time until Disney started really stretching copyright law. But I think we're probably going to start seeing it happen more and more with familiar stories like we did with Winnie the Pooh a few years ago when it entered public domain. The only problem I have with them splitting Wicked into two movies is I keep seeing the worst possible takes about Glinda in No One Mourns the Wicked. If you've only seen this movie, you have literally no idea why she is singing this or why she throws the torch onto the statue. There is a whole other movie that takes place between Defying Gravity and this scene. And even without part 2 in mind, I think this movie alone makes it very clear that Glinda is upset during this whole sequence and is just putting on a face for the Munchkins. And if you know what happens in part 2 and you know why she's singing this song, there is practically no way that you can call her a bad friend or the villain or anything like that. You can hate Glinda for different reasons. Like, if you come out of the show and hate her for something other than No One Mourns the Wicked, that's fine. But the amount of people who are saying things about this number that are completely, like, out of line with the context of the full musical is so frustrating. And I understand, like, they've only seen this movie. I'm not blaming them. But it's just frustrating that we have to wait a whole year and see so many people over the course of the next year have hot takes about just this song without the context of why it's being sung. And spoilers ahead for those who want to understand what I'm talking about. Elphaba tells her to do exactly this. She doesn't even want to be doing this. She just thinks that she is fulfilling her best friend's dying request. She's literally like, make sure they all still hate me and don't tell them the truth. So I just feel like I'm going crazy every time I see a post about it, about how Glinda's awful for, like, saying all this stuff about her friend or whatever. And it's like, that's what she wanted. And while we're at it, I also think it's worth reminding everyone that Dorothy did not actually kill the Wicked Witch of the East. I know all the characters act like she did, and it's fun to joke about it as if she had, like it's funny calling Dorothy a professional witch killer, but I've seen a few too many people making serious points that partially are built on the fact that she killed the Wicked Witch of the East, which she did not do. And I'm actually surprised more people don't joke about the fact that there is this collective misunderstanding that happens in this movie that caused the characters to gaslight this little girl into thinking that she somehow killed this woman because she was in a house that happened to get swept up in a tornado that landed on someone, no part of that story did she have any control over. She didn't even own the house. She's just a little girl. And I know she doesn't look like a little girl in this movie, even though she's supposed to be one. But even if she was 16, that still doesn't mean that she somehow caused this house to land on this person. I suppose you could argue that specifically in this movie and like no other version, the whole thing is a dream. So technically she caused the death of the Wicked Witch of the East because she dreamt her dead. But, like, she also dreamt all of them into existence in the first place. And even with that logic, we know she didn't cause the tornado because the tornado is what knocks her out in the first place. She is dreaming all of this, in part, because of the tornado. And in pretty much every other version of the story, like Wicked, it's not a dream. And so she just happens to be in this house that lands on someone. I know I keep repeating that, but it's because we literally all pretend like she did. Like, the Munchkins not only gaslit her into thinking that she killed the Wicked Witch of the East, but also gaslit all of us into thinking that. And in their defense, they misunderstand. They think she's magic or whatever. Glinda thinks that she's a witch, but she's not. We know that she's not. It was just happenstance. And on the topic of Wicked, just to give the tiniest, vaguest spoiler of what's going to happen in part 2, there is somebody who explicitly is the reason for the tornado, and it's not Dorothy. So even when it's not a naturally occurring thing, Dorothy has literally zero control over the tornado. And I kind of feel like I'm going crazy because I've seen multiple people today say, fully serious. A lot of people joke about this, and those videos are great. They're hilarious. But I've seen multiple people today make an argument based off of the fact that Dorothy is bad for having killed the Wicked Witch of the East. Or at the very least, like, there are things that happen to her that are justified, or like she should be held accountable for, or something in some way, for killing the Wicked Witch of the East, which she did not do. She didn't. A house fell on her, guys. Dorothy was not steering the house. She didn't make the house move. She was just in the house, guys. She was in the house. And this whole misunderstanding and gaslighting is a feature of the story, not a bug. A big part of The Wizard of Oz is all about propaganda and, like, false realities and, being made to believe something because you're simply told it. In a way, this idea that she killed the Wicked Witch of the East is the same as the wizard. It's a false reality that her reputation becomes built around and even affects her own choices and decisions as if she had actually done it, which she hadn't. She was just a girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. A few people have asked me to talk about conservatives who think the wizard represents Democrats and Elphaba represents Trump. And at first I wasn't going to until I saw this video where she's basically saying it's the exact same thing as viewing him as Trump and Elphaba as Democrats or leftists or anyone else against Trump. Because to her, in both cases, it is simply a person that we believe is a liar who is tricking a whole bunch of people, and then somebody who realizes that this person is a liar and then gets painted as the bad guy for saying that. And I understand how she came to that conclusion, but I think it's misreading why people think that he is Trump. I'm going to try to be fairly neutral in describing this so we can understand why this is different than reading him as a Democrat who is lying to everyone. And we're going to do that by looking at the type of support he has, how he maintains power, and where that is in conflict with Elphaba. While I think the biggest aspect of that is how he maintains power, I want to start with the type of support he has because it really shows why we're not able to compare these readings. And I also think a lot of Trump supporters are unaware of this aspect of non-conservative culture. So it's true that the wizard uses propaganda to trick everyone into believing what he wants them to. And so if you're already inclined to view Democratic politicians as liars, then you might view him as one. Just as if you're already inclined to view Republican politicians as liars, then you might also do so. However, him being Trump specifically is different than if he was just some generic Republican. Because it's not just that he lies to his supporters, they also worship him. He has essentially tricked them into thinking he is this powerful, godly being. And while many Trump supporters worship Trump in a very similar way, nobody worships Democrats like this. And again, I think this is something a lot of conservatives don't realize is the case. There are a lot of people who voted for Biden, for example, who did not like him, but even the people who loved him do not have a shrine for him in their household. And in fact, I would say that's the case for even other conservative politicians. People do not worship them the way that they do Trump. And obviously there are Trump voters who don't do this, but many do very openly, and nobody on the left is doing that. Even the people who are the most hardcore Democrats ever are not doing that. And so when we're talking about him as Trump, it's not a transferable reading to viewing him as a generic Democrat. In addition to that, and again, probably the most significant, both maintain power by being demagogues. The wizard turns people against the animals so that he can continue his charade, while Trump blames pretty much everything on trans people and immigrants. And I'm not going to try to convince you by showing you the evidence of what he's saying about them are lies, because I understand that you will feel like that itself is a lie. But you can check for yourself. He's blaming fractions of the population. Only 1% of people are trans on the majority of problems, specifically in order to make wide-ranging changes that affect the majority of the population. Banning trans people from using the bathroom causes problems for anyone who happens to look androgynous, even if they are not trans at all. Mass deportation and tariffs are going to cost everyone a lot of money. Not even getting into him saying he wants to remove the Department of Education. The wizard and Trump both blame everything on a specific minority population in order to make grand changes. Not to mention that they're both leaders/politicians who do not have any experience in doing so, and instead come from a background of failing at business. Again, I'm trying to be somewhat neutral, but that just is the situation. But you'll notice both of them are blaming everything on specific minority groups, whereas Elphaba is blaming everything on the wizard or the system as a whole. This is an important distinction in understanding how we can allegorically read Elphaba if we want to apply them to real life. Because Trump is not saying this one person is lying to everyone and creating this system around them. Instead, he's saying these groups of people are the problem, and Democrats are allowing them to exist or are supporting them in some way. So it's a lot harder to view Elphaba as being Trump rather than being Democrats who are specifically trying to call out the wizard, aka Trump, or leftists who are specifically trying to call out the whole system. But I think the reason conservatives think of her as Trump is because she's vilified, and they see him as being someone who's vilified, trying to call out and fix the larger system. But Elphaba is not just vilified for calling out the wizard. She is initially vilified for the color of her skin, and then he brands her as an enemy of the state before she has any kind of influential power. Trump is not viewed as a bad guy because Democrats are telling him that he is one. Trump is viewed as a bad guy because of the things that he did in office and the actual things that he is saying. He's primarily seen as bad because he's done things like not have a peaceful transition of power. That's not something that Democrats just said he did and we all believe them. That's something he actually just did and we all witnessed him do. He called Mike Pence a traitor for inaugurating the next president. He's not this person who is being painted as a villain because he's being lied about. You can believe some things that Democrats say about him are lies, but a lot of the stuff that people don't like about him are things that he just straight up said or did. But a lot of the things that conservatives don't like about Democrats are stuff that Trump has verifiably lied about, like saying that they wanted to give illegal immigrants in prison transgender surgeries. And I know that might feel like going back to the whole, well, I believe these people are lying and I believe these people are lying. But when it comes to certain lies, you can just check on your own. Like when Trump says, these people are saying XYZ, like these people are saying that trans people deserve whatever, you can go and find out that they're not. Also interesting how he makes her an enemy of the state, just as Trump calls leftists the enemy within, which is something that Democrats are not doing. They're not saying that about Trump supporters and conservatives. I think, in the end, if you view Democrats as primarily lying, I understand a very, very, basic reading of thinking that he might be a Democrat and, doing some kind of propaganda for everyone, but he is undeniably comparable to Trump in so many ways, even if you do not believe that Trump is a liar. And you might be upset by that because he's the villain, but the people who wrote this story view people like Trump as villains. And I avoided using the word fascist throughout this video because I think a lot of conservatives hear that word and just tune out. But the way he is using the animals as a scapegoat is just textbook fascism, and that is what makes him so big as a villain. It's pretty much the same thing Trump does with trans people and immigrants. And in the end, the decisions he makes based on using them as a scapegoat end up affecting everyone. Also, he won the popular vote over a woman who has a different skin color than he does, who was basically just running on a campaign of saying, by the way, this guy is causing all of these problems for everyone. And a few people respond to my Glinda video with a similar sentiment to this, and I find it interesting because every time that I see it expressed, it seems to be saying that this interpretation is wrong because systems cannot be dismantled from within, rather than saying the text is wrong because systems cannot be dismantled from within. I think this is a really important distinction to make because sometimes fictional stories will say something that we disagree with or is factually wrong, but they're not always written with that knowledge or mindset. Spoilers for Act 2 of Wicked, but this story in particular was constructed in a way that required somebody from both the outside and inside in order to take down the wizard. Elphaba says in For Good that she needs Glinda to take down the wizard, that she needs someone in Glinda's position to change the system. And there's so much evidence throughout the text that the point is both of them are doing good and bad things, and both are required in order to make some kind of change happen. Of course, you might be able to interpret Glinda or this text differently, but you can't negate an interpretation based off it not reflecting real life accurately, because sometimes stories don't. And you can critique the story for that. Out of Her Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft is a novella that basically says people who are different are bad. Obviously, there's other ways to look at the story, but that is a very easy, clear interpretation, and one that is often being done by people in order to critique the story rather than be in agreement with that interpretation. I'm not saying that my video was meant to be a critique, it was mostly just an analysis of a character's motivation based off close reading the words that she said, but also what the text itself is saying. And in that regard, I understand the assumption that I must be in agreement with the implications that this has for real life. However, I am very surprised by the amount of people who have taken that to say that the interpretation is wrong rather than its conclusion is. Like, in the end, it is a good thing within the text that Glinda stayed. And I understand why saying that might upset someone, especially because I say it so neutrally, but I think there's a lot of value in having conversations about fictional texts with close reading understandings of them, even if we end up disagreeing with those interpretations. Although I'm curious to see what other people think, and generally I just think it's good that we're having discussions on interpretations at all. Okay, I'm going to get a little English teachery for a moment because last week I kept seeing people call Glinda the villain, and this week I keep seeing people say, oh, she's actually the antagonist. And in both cases, essentially their reasoning is that she is a bad person. If you want to make this argument that she is a bad, selfish person based off stuff she does in the movie or show, that's fine, but I highly recommend that you do so without using either of those terms, especially with the word the in front of them. Villain I will give more of a pass to because I know not everyone is using it in its specific literary sense, but antagonist is always being used that way. So even if you want to say that she's a bad friend because of XYZ, that doesn't make her the antagonist because that's not what the word means. You can be a bad person and not be an antagonist. Which, side note, the way people keep saying the villain or especially the antagonist has been bothering me because there is very obviously multiple antagonists in this story. Even if we want to pretend that she fits that definition, there's still at least two, kind of three, distinct antagonists, one of which is much more appropriate to call the villain than her. And again, I understand some people mean something else when they're calling her the villain, but when you're referring to her as an antagonist, calling her the antagonist implies that she is the one driving all of, like, the negative things that happen in the plot. Like, she is the actual one opposing Elphaba or whatever. As in, the wizard or Morble just don't exist. But even with that in mind, she's still not an antagonist. Sure, she is antagonistic towards Elphaba before they become friends. And again, spoilers for Act 2, I'll have like a little thing here to let you know where to skip to. But again, in Act 2, she has a single moment after being betrayed by Fiyero where she does something antagonistic towards Elphaba. But aside from that, she is in no way really the antagonist. And that small amount of antagonism is very appropriate for somebody in her role in the story, which is the protagonist. Yes, Elphaba is the main character, but she is essentially the secondary protagonist because we are also following her story, just to a slightly lesser degree. And you can still call her a bad person if you want to, while acknowledging that she is a protagonist. Protagonist does not mean good person. It doesn't even mean hero. And same with antagonist. There can be good people that are antagonists, and there can be bad people who are protagonists. I think the story is very clear by the end that both characters are meant to be seen as both good and bad, and it's just not as simple in terms of morality. And it's fine to disagree with the story, to feel differently about these characters and their actions, but that doesn't mean that their role in the story is different. You can simply just say that they are a bad person because of these things that you perceive them to be a bad person for, rather than saying that they are an antagonist. And if you have been doing this, referring to her as an antagonist simply because you think that she's a bad person, it's fine. I'm not trying to, mock you or anything. I'm just imploring you in the future to simply say that she's a bad friend or a bad person or whatever it is that you actually think about her, rather than assigning her a literary role that doesn't apply to her character. Talk about the difference between foreshadowing and dramatic irony using this scene from Winkie.
A celebration throughout Oz, that's all to do with me.
So firstly, foreshadowing is when the audience is being given subtle hints about future events. For example, when Elphaba accidentally breaks the image of the wizard and we see an animal mural underneath it, that is foreshadowing the future reveal that the wizard is the one pushing the animals out of Oz. Now, separate from foreshadowing, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that the characters don't. This is usually done to create unique emotional reactions. Think of the ending of Romeo and Juliet, where the audience knows that Juliet is faking her death, but Romeo does not. So it is especially tragic for us watching as Romeo kills himself, thinking that she's actually dead when we know that she's not. That tension that we feel is from the dramatic irony. There are many examples of this happening in Wicked, but right now we're talking about in The Wizard and I, she sings about a celebration throughout Oz that's all to do with her. How she'd be so happy she could melt. These lines are additionally tragic and humorous for the audience since we know from the beginning that this celebration is of her death via melting. And before anyone comments about what happens in Act 2, I'll address that at the end. But the point is, she is excited and happy because she sees a vision where people seem to be celebrating her. And in reality, we, the audience, know that they are simply celebrating her death. And in Defying Gravity, she sings again about how she's going to match them in renown. She knows that there is going to be some big celebration of her at some point. We know the context of it is different than what she thinks it's going to be. Now, spoilers ahead for part 2 to address the one big Act 2 thing that I know someone is going to comment about. Yes, she does not actually die. However, this celebration is still about her death. They think that she's dead, and that is what they are celebrating. That is the dramatic irony here and why it is so tragic. She is specifically excited about being celebrated by them. We, the audience, know that when this happens, they'll be doing the opposite of what she wants here. So just because we're on the topic, I'll leave you with my favorite example of foreshadowing.
Life is painless for the brainless.
The last 15 years, cultural criticism has been mostly garbage. And now, Ben Shapiro's rambling, unedited review of Wicked is now giving people a taste of what cultural criticism used to be.
I don't make an accusation like this lightly, but I genuinely do not believe you watched the video that you're talking about. I don't know why you're pretending like he said anything groundbreaking or original in this video. Every opinion that he shared is something I had already heard someone else say, which, by the way, is not a dig at him or the video itself. The point of a review is to share your opinion, and it is okay, perhaps even a good thing, to have a similar opinion to other people. The reason people were so surprised about his video is because they were not expecting him specifically to have these opinions about Wicked. To act like he's not afraid of getting canceled, as if the majority of the opinions that people are enjoying about that video are ones that someone else would be afraid to say somehow. And despite being somebody who doesn't like Ben Shapiro, I do have a surprising amount of positive things to say about this review, perhaps precisely because it is not an unedited rambling. They also wouldn't treat it like it's the first piece of good popular cultural criticism in the last 15 years like you seem to think it is. It is true that many social media film critics are ideologues who base their reviews almost entirely off of their own moralistic standards. Ben Shapiro very much included outside of this singular review. Maybe there's one I missed, but I skimmed many of his reviews trying to find one that is not based almost entirely within his own ideology outside of this video. This is the only review that I could find where his judgment of the movie's quality is primarily based in its film creation and music design rather than its ideology. Although it would be a lie to say that his ideology is not being discussed in regards to this film. It simply is in his review. That's something you might not be aware of if you've only seen people talking about it online, because that is not the part that people were surprised enough to make commentary on. He says at the beginning of his video that he has an ideological conflict with the themes of Wicked. Claims that the original Wizard of Oz books aren't woke, which I'm not entirely sure how he reconciles that idea with characters like Ozma, but I do understand what he's saying when compared to Wicked, where he is correct in saying that it is significantly more overt in its political theming. He also has a mini rant about them gaying up Dancing Through Life and Ariana and Cynthia acting gay on their press tour. And sure, it is a generally tame rant, especially compared to his one about Defying Gravity, but we don't need to pretend like it's ideologically neutral when it's clearly not. It doesn't change the story at all to have both men and women interested in Fiyero, and I think he's mischaracterizing the press tour because he's the one that doesn't understand that friends can hold hands and it not be gay. He's the one making it out to be a much bigger deal than it is, probably because his followers really care about it for some reason. And to his credit, it's a short rant, but we don't need to pretend like it's not there.
If dudes are friends, they must be gay, and if two ladies are friends, they must be lesbians. Do these people have any friends? Like, any friends at all? What is wrong with people that they, like, do they feel the necessity to f all of their friends? It's very strange. Anyway, that is not a necessity in this musical, and it's stupid. In Dancing Through Life, there is a bunch of this sort of stuff where he's flirting with both boys and girls, and it's dumb, and there's no reason for it.
And while I think we can appreciate the fact that he goes on to have a legitimate review because, as he says, he loves musicals, especially Stephen Schwartz's music, that doesn't mean we have to pretend like everything he goes on to say is high quality criticism. I think generally it's good. I wish more reviews were like the latter part of his video, but he's not making like insanely analytical commentary. It is Cynthia Erivo is an amazing singer, and Ariana Grande is not performing Glinda in the way that I like, because I vastly prefer Kristen Chenoweth. And while I disagree with some aspects of his commentary, for the most part, it is things that I can agree to disagree on, which is shocking coming from Ben Shapiro. That is the part that is so surprising for people, not what it is that he's saying exactly. One thing he talks about is he doesn't like that there's this part of Elphaba's backstory where she blames herself for Nessa Rose's condition / their mother's death. It's obvious to us that it's not her fault, but he thinks that it should be obvious to her as well. And he doesn't like when movies and shows do this thing where the character is essentially just being told that they should feel this way and therefore they feel that way. In my opinion, that is probably the weakest criticism that he has in this entire video. Feels very much like the general criticism of characters who do not think things all the way through or are instead too wrapped up in their own emotions in order to make a logical decision. And the reality is, not everyone does that. She was raised to believe that it was her fault, that this is on her, that Nessa is like this and that her mother died. But I do think it's okay to have that opinion in a review. I think that it's fine to not enjoy that about certain characters. But it is not this strong, high-quality, groundbreaking cultural criticism. I do wish there were more reviews like this from other people. There are, but I do understand this feeling of wanting more to be like this. However, I think the person that I stitched is wrong about what makes this a good review. I also think a much bigger problem than ideologues trying to do film criticism is CinemaSins type videos trying to do media criticism in any way. I think that's why criticism like this seems to be so incredible to some people, because they are used to CinemaSins style stuff, which is very bad criticism. Or it's because they didn't watch the video at all and they think that he is doing something significantly different than what he actually is. Glinda is the only character here that is native to Gillikin country, where Shiz is located. And I think that has some interesting implications for how each of these characters are treated throughout the film. I think it's likely that the majority of students at Shiz are from Gillikin country. That's why when Glinda was introduced, it's clear that a lot of the students already know who she is. Of course there are students from other countries, but the fact that characters like Fiyero and Bok feel the need to mention what country they're from, whereas the characters from Gillikin like Glinda and Morble never do, is notable. Students at Shiz seem to already be Glinda's peers that she's simply popular amongst, given how comfortable they are with talking to and about her, despite any potential nobility or status that her last name might hold, if any. The students themselves treat her as a paragon of the community, as if she is already Glinda the Good to them. Contrast this with someone like Fiyero, who is foreign royalty. He got kicked out of the Royal Academy of Winkie country, which he is native to, and presumably where his peers were. Now everybody at Shiz adores him because he's this fun prince who's a bit of a rebel, but nobody seems to already know him personally. He doesn't really have any acquaintances at Shiz, which furthers the implication that there are very few Winkies here because it's probably mostly Gillikins. Of course, you could say maybe it's because there's mostly commoners at Shiz, but it does seem to be a pretty prestigious school. It has the wizards, personal sorceress there. Plus, Glinda's parents and Nessa's father probably would want to put them in a prestigious school. But either way, the fact that Fiyero doesn't seem to have anyone that he's already acquainted with, and possibly doesn't even have many other people from his country here, really fits with the themes that his character has. While upbeat and fun, Dancing Through Life is kind of a nihilistic song. Basically saying nothing matters because we're all gonna die someday anyways, so we may as well just party and not worry about anything or think about anything or bother with school. In actuality, he is just sad and alone, both in a literal sense upon entering Shiz, but also in a figurative one throughout the movie until he has that experience with Elphaba in The Lion King. Now, obviously, the way people treat Nessa and Elphaba differently is not because they are effectively Munchkin royalty as the daughters of the governor, but instead because Elphaba's green and Nessa's in a wheelchair. Although I think the students' surprised reaction to Elphaba is further indication that while there are definitely some Munchkins there, it probably is mostly Gillikins going to this school. Most Munchkins, especially those that are well connected enough to go to Shiz, probably know about Elphaba, or at the very least, Nessa. We saw Munchkin kids picking on them when they were younger, and Nessa wants to use this opportunity of going to Shiz to get away from like their past and the reputation that she might have because of Elphaba. Or really just that she blames Elphaba for, because obviously it is not her fault that kids are prejudiced towards her because of her skin color. Now, obviously, Nessa wouldn't be as infantilized as she is by everyone around her if she wasn't in a wheelchair, and Elphaba wouldn't be treated with so much prejudice if she didn't have green skin, but I suspect they wouldn't be treated with the same reverence that Fiyero and Glinda are, despite being in effectively a similar station as the daughters of the governor. Munchkinland seems to be quite a bit poorer, at least in terms of aesthetics, from Gillikin or presumably Winkie Country as well. At the very least, they don't have actual royalty like Winkie Country does. The architecture is also clearly that of a more agricultural society. We also get multiple reminders about Bach being a munchkin. He says it when he's meeting Glinda. He says it right before Dancing Through Life, and also it's said in Dancing Through Life. Also, as a little side note, I think it's interesting how Bach is the only one of these characters who doesn't seem to have any kind of connection that brought him to Shiz. Like, Glinda, Fiyero, and Nessa have their families that clearly are part of the reason why they're there, and Elphaba has Morble, who is very much the reason why she's there. As far as him being a munchkin goes, I've seen people speculate that all of the students who have orange in their design, like in their uniform designs, are a munchkin, which is very far from the majority of them, but definitely a noticeable amount. But if that's true, it would be interesting how frequently him being a munchkin gets brought up, considering, like, students would know then that he is a munchkin if that was the case, that all of them wore orange in their uniforms. But when it comes to how he is treated as a munchkin, I think it's interesting how frequently the munchkins in the movie are deceived. Like, at the beginning of the movie, Glinda is deceiving the munchkins by pretending that she is also happy that Elphaba is dead, even though she's clearly very upset about it. Elphaba's mom was deceiving her husband. And Glinda is deceiving, or really more so manipulating Bach into leaving her alone, at least when it comes to getting him to ask out Nessa instead of her. He is somewhat belittled by the non-Munchkin characters, at least the two that we see him interacting with. Of course, this deleted scene would have evolved these relationships between the characters, and there would be less of those kind of dynamics in regards to their interrelationships here. But I just thought it was interesting to discuss some of the potential implications of these characters' nationalities, and also the possibility that the majority of Shiz students are Gillikins. But let me know what you guys think. I'm curious because I haven't heard anyone talk about this yet, and it's interesting considering the different nationalities that comprise the main cast. I recommend not using the Wicked book as a basis for understanding the lore of the Wicked movie. This isn't directed at this commenter specifically. I've seen a lot of comments like this, and it's important to understand how different the book is from the musical, which the movie is based on. Like, yes, in the book, Winkie is a derogatory term for people from Vinkus, like Fiyero. But in the Wicked movie, musical, and the original Wizard of Oz, Winkie is just the name of the country. If you want to use the book as a basis for your personal interpretation of the movie, that's fine and can be interesting, but you have to reconcile why Fiyero refers to himself as being from Winkie Country, why the announcement refers to the school that he came from being the Royal Academy of Winkie, and why the newspaper that Glinda is reading when she finds out that Fiyero is coming to the school also refers to Winkie as, like, the Winkies as a sports team versus the Munchkins on the back. We also shouldn't really take it at face value that this is actually the Fiyero of the books, because he is a composite character of Fiyero and Averick. They just happen to go with the name Fiyero, but he is both of those characters, in the same way that Bach is both Bach and Nick Chopper from the book. Although, quick side note, as somebody who studies adaptations, I find it quite interesting how often Oz adaptations like to use composite characters in this way, and how that further affects future stories that take place in Oz. The most obvious and wide-ranging one being Glinda, who in the original L. Frank Baum books is the Witch of the South, and in some adaptations she still is. But in the 1939 Wizard of Oz film, she is a composite character of the Witch of the South and the Witch of the North, where she is then referred to as Glinda the Witch of the North. And in multiple adaptations, including Wicked, she then becomes the Good Witch of the North. Because while many of these do pull from the original Oz books, books, they also often use the 1939 film as their main source. I just think that's really interesting and can highlight for us how difficult it can sometimes be trying to use the lore of the source material as the basis for understanding an adaptation. Although I will say, obviously, adaptations are not always as drastically different as the book Wicked to the musical Wicked. Many of them are like the musical Wicked to the movie, where it seems to follow pretty much the same exact story. There's just some things added to it. The changes from musical to movie are very minimal, and a lot of the people who worked on the musical also worked on the movie. So we can use the musical to help us in our understanding of the movie if we want to view it as an extension. In a similar way to how many people view the Hunger Games movies as an extension of the books, because they seem to be very faithful to them. There's just a few things added because we get to see perspectives that we couldn't see in the books. But that's not the case when it comes to Wicked the book to Wicked the movie. Not only is the movie not actually based on the book, it's based on the musical, but the differences between the book and the musical are vast. In part because the musical was cut a lot from the book. I mean, the book is significantly longer than how much time the musical has, but also it's written by different people and trying to tell a different story. It does make it interesting to think about why make certain changes. Why did they decide to remove the Vinkus Winkie stuff? Why did they decide to composite Fiyero and Averick? In the book, Fiyero is othered by the students at Shiz because he is a foreigner, whereas in the movie, you could argue that he is using being a foreigner and not knowing anyone in order to distance himself emotionally from the people around him. Movie Fiyero is popular in a very similar way to Glinda, including the fact that his relationships are very shallow until he meets Elphaba, who we can use the book to better understand how he might be able to connect with her by being somebody who is also on the outskirts of society as a foreigner in this country. But unlike the book, there is nuance to it there because it is not actually a shared form of discrimination. He's not experiencing the same thing that she is. And this is because he is also Averick. But this experience with the lion cub and Elphaba allows him to start seeing things differently in a way that is not the same as it is in the book. And again, I'm not trying to shut down conversations about the book. I think it's very interesting and worth discussing, especially when we're talking about the movie. But I do think it's worth understanding that the movie has a different lore. The movie and musical have a different lore than the book, and there are going to be many differences, including this. Let's do another close reading of some Wicked scenes, because I actually think this deleted scene of Glinda telling Elphaba that she could have picked her to help rescue the lion cub instead of Fiyero doesn't defeat the purpose of this conversation on the train platform, but actually enhances it, and I'd love to discuss how. So the movie, as it is right now without this scene, actually already gives us an indication that Glinda is likely aware that Fiyero and Elphaba ran off with the lion cub. At the very least, we see her acknowledgement that Fiyero and Elphaba are missing after waking up from the poppy spell. And I think the confusion here from this commenter and some others that I've seen is because Glinda seems to not understand why Fiyero is so affected by this day. She is misattributing it to what happened to Dr. Dillamond instead of what happened with the lion cub. Here is the really important and interesting aspect to this. As far as Glinda knows, even with this scene, Elphaba is the one who cared about rescuing the lion cub. As far as Glinda knows, Fiyero's the man who said nothing matters and life is fraughtless when you're thoughtless, hence why she's surprised and concerned that he is thinking. And even if this scene had been included, Elphaba says that Fiyero helped her rescue the lion cub, as in Elphaba was the one who wanted to rescue the cub. What she doesn't know is that this is how it actually went down. I'm sure Elphaba would have rescued the lion cub either way, but she didn't purposely cast the spell to do that. It was subconsciously done. And while she was still processing what happened, Fiyero gets up and rescues the cub all on his own without being asked and without understanding what was happening. No hesitation. It was his own thought that he did without any coercing. This is the part that Glinda was not aware of. He was not just helping Elphaba. He was an active participant in rescuing that cub. She also doesn't know the details of the actual conversations that went down that day and how any of that may have affected him. To her, the major thing that happened that day is Dr. Dillamond's disappearance. In fact, that's probably what the majority of the student body are talking about, and what he does list as one of the two things that he keeps thinking about that day. And the thoughts that he's having likely are about Dr. Dillamond, because the cub is already rescued. Dillamond does not. And one last point I want to mention before I get into what the purpose of the scene might actually be is that the student body actually is not nearly as discriminatory towards the animals on a prejudice level that the government is. There's definitely microaggressions like Glinda being upset on how Dr. Dillamond pronounces her name, and there's probably some like actual anti-animal students. But you'll notice when Elphaba calls out the other students, it's not because they are being discriminatory towards animals, it's because they are being passive when discrimination is happening. That's why the students are clapping when Glinda is doing this performative act. They do genuinely view it as a bad thing, what is happening to Dillamond. They just are unwilling to do anything about it. Now, you may be thinking that this scene shows Glinda's insecurity because she doesn't understand Fiyero. And that is true, because his whole introduction was a song and dance about how he doesn't care about anything and he doesn't like thinking thoughts. The biggest insecure moment where Elphaba and Fiyero are sharing a look and Glinda is confused and then she goes in between them, that's because she was not there for their deep self-reflective talk in the jungle, not because she didn't know that they went to rescue the lion cub together. And without this deleted scene, it seems like she's mostly insecure about Fiyero. That's why she goes in between them to kind of break up their stare. She wants to be able to say that she too can relate to what he is experiencing, and she does that through what happened with Dr. Dillamond, which is the part that she experienced. But what's interesting with this deleted scene in mind is that she would also then be insecure about Elphaba. She was left behind and she did not get to experience whatever happened between them. But if she had been taken, she would have. She would be the one to have whatever look that they are having. And this scene makes it all the more powerful when Elphaba takes Glinda with her because she says, "I'm not going to leave you behind again." And that's also when the train starts while No One Mourns the Wicked is playing in the background and they're looking back and forth at each other. It's still a strong and moving moment, but it would mean even more if we had this scene because we would know that Elphaba is once again leaving Glinda behind, and then in the last moment choosing not to. And No One Mourns the Wicked is essentially about how Glinda has been left behind. So it makes perfect sense that that's the song that we'd be playing in the background as the train is taking off. I do think it's possible that if this scene had been included, it would narrow our interpretations to be more specifically about this instead of being a little more open-ended. But I think it would really tighten the connection between these characters and works incredibly well with the train platform scene as is. And also really helps to contextualize and make Defying Gravity even more emotional. Hello, editing Troy here. I just want to make two final quick notes. There is an interview where John M. Chu says that there are many reasons why they didn't include this scene, although he wanted to. But one of them, at the very end, he says part of the reason is that it could have made this train station scene a little bit confusing because of Glinda's unawareness. It's definitely not in thematic conflict or defeating the purpose the way this commenter says, but I think he means it's a bit confusing that Glinda is not able to put two and two together when she sees Fiyero and Elphaba have their weird interaction and she's confused about what that might be. However, if he wanted us to think that Glinda was unaware that Elphaba and Fiyero were together the day that Dr. Dillamond was taken away / the lion cub was rescued, then he shouldn't have included the scene where she wakes up from the poppy spell and looks at Fiyero's chair, empty seat, and then looks at Elphaba's empty seat and then looks away. The only purpose of that scene is to tell us that Glinda is aware of what she's not aware of everything that happened like I talked about in this video, but she is definitely cognizant of the fact that Elphaba chose Fiyero, that Elphaba cast this poppy spell and made everyone fall asleep except for Fiyero, and also that the lion cub was missing. So whether or not this scene is included, Glinda should be aware that they were together that day. And the final thing I want to say is normally I would have included clips about what I'm talking about so you can actually see the scenes, but we have a very limited time left on this app, so I figured that I would upload it as is, and everyone here is smart enough to understand the scenes that I'm talking about. If you want to see more of my content, though, I highly recommend going here so that you can find more that's going to have more time for it to be made in. There's an interesting parallel between Glinda's bubble and Elphaba's broom as magical modes of transportation that reflect the sort of power they have. Glinda's bubble is as fragile as the power she holds, which, like the wizard before her, is reliant on the people of Oz's opinion of her. In the movie, at least, it is mechanical and constructed, based on more of an illusion of magic rather than magic itself. It's no wonder we see it during No One Mourns the Wicked, where she's being very careful in what she says to avoid the Ozians turning on her. Because of their shape, bubbles themselves also reflect a distorted version of reality, one that typically has a rainbow inside of it. Unlike still water that can actually reflect your appearance back at you, bubbles work like a sort of funhouse mirror with an additional veneer of sunshine and happiness through their rainbow. What's interesting about Glinda's bubble is it does have this sort of reflective quality, as we can see here, where it's kind of distorting its reflection of the sky, but its primary purpose is to display what is inside of it. While it does reflect a rainbow, it's not like the same soapy rainbow that you might see in a real bubble. Instead, it primarily has this sheen of pink that morphs everything inside of it. There's a lot of ways that we could interpret this, but for me, I think pink works as a sort of safety color for her and reflects her status as being different than everyone else. While there are a lot of pink objects in Oz, it actually doesn't seem to be a very common color for people to wear outside of Glinda, especially not her shade of it. And it's not hard to see how it could be a symbol of her popularity and eventual status, especially considering that the pinkest scene in the whole movie is during Popular, especially when she sings about her own popularity. And an important parallel this has with green being symbolic of Elphaba is that Glinda has the option to take off her pink, but Elphaba does not have the option to take off her green. But when Glinda leaves this bubble and is not symbolically protected by the sheen of pink, she has to be significantly more careful than when she was. Of course, the Ozians still love her, but it's interesting how this is when we see how conflicted she is when she sings. Something that might be easier to hide from within the bubble. Now, all of that is part of the symbolism of this bubble, but I think to look at it on a deeper level, we need to talk about why it's there to begin with. Now, an obvious answer would be that it's there because it's in the 1939 film, but that begs the question, why is it here? Glinda's bubble, along with the Wicked Witches flying on a broom, are actually original to this movie and not the L. Frank Baum books that it's based on. Glinda is very pink in those books, but she does not, nor does anybody else as far as I know, travel through a bubble. It also is quite different than it is in magic. This bubble seems to be created from real magic, and the pink in the inside seems to be coming from her essence or her own light rather than the bubble itself. And Glinda's role in this story is quite different. It's worth thinking about her as a sort of fairy godmother to Dorothy, and perhaps to the Munchkins themselves. Her traveling on a bubble is very in line with the whimsicality of Oz, which she is representing. She seems to be like the real Oz, as opposed to the Wizard of Oz, who is a fraud, or the Wicked Witch, who is evil. She's not just the good of the North, she is the good of Oz. I know people have their opinions about her actions as well as the other Glindas, but we're talking about the symbolism and her role in the story. It's important to understand that the end message for Dorothy in this version of the Wizard of Oz is that she shouldn't want to leave Kansas to begin with. Adventuring is fun, this whimsy is fun, but it's a lot more dangerous than she expected it to be, and it's without her loved ones and whatnot. But this is before any of that, and this is kind of introducing us to more of the fun of Oz that Dorothy can get wrapped up in before she sees how dangerous and bad it actually is. And Glinda is also there to challenge her understanding and perspective of what a witch can be. Witches aren't all ugly and evil. Some of them can be beautiful and feminine, hence the pink. It's also interesting how she travels down from the sky with no indication of where she was, as if she's descending from heaven. Unlike this Glinda, who may or may not be actually magical, but at least some of the magic is not real, and we know where she was. And these Munchkins do seem to view her the same way they do in the 1939 film. All of these things, all of that symbolism that's happening is in-universe happening. It's in-universe real. But we know that a lot of it is a facade. And in that transition of understanding, the bubble changes from just being about whimsy to being the fragility of that whimsy. Or at least the fragility of its appearance, as well as her status within it. There's just so many interesting things to take away here. And I'll be posting a follow-up discussing the symbolism of Elphaba's broom here.